So yes, I think I'll make the executive decision, say that we can begin in a more formal way. So welcome to this webinar on behalf of the Consortium of Endowed Episcopal Parishes. My name is Richard Weinberg, and it's my privilege to serve as the rector of St. Margaret's Episcopal Church in Washington, D.C. I've served at St. Margaret's for 3 years. The Diocese of Washington is my home diocese, but St. Margaret's is the first place that I've served as a priest. So DC is a homecoming, though I went to seminary in Atlanta. So I have some connections across the church, and glad that we have panelists today who are joining from London, from Jacksonville, Florida. I'm here in DC, and from Atlanta, Georgia. So we have a little bit of diversity, not as much diversity in the US in terms of time zones, but certainly diversity from both the UK and our American perspective here on this side of the pond. We also want to acknowledge our Heart Edge partners who have been partnering with SEEP for a series of webinars. I believe this is at least the third. Yes, we do invite you throughout our event today to post your questions in the chat box. As moderator, I'm going to do my very best to monitor the question. It is always helpful if you put Q:, so that I know it's a question, because you certainly can engage with one another and with what you're hearing by just commenting and having continued conversation in the chat box. Sometimes it's kind of like two events are going on at once. You have those of us who are the talking heads, and then you have those of you with real life experience also reflecting on what you're hearing and bringing your experience to the conversation, which is just as important. So I said yes to moderating this because at my parish in St. Margaret's, we have a ministry called Charlie's Place, which is named for the founder of the ministry some 30 years ago. And Charlie's Place is seeking to come alongside our neighbors experiencing homelessness. We've been doing it for 30 years, but just in my short 3-year tenure at St. Margaret's, we've seen the needs of our community experiencing homelessness grow tremendously. And of course, in light of COVID-19, those changes have become much more acute and overwhelming as a parish of a mid-size to be able to navigate and respond to. We've just begun in partnership with the Lupton Center that you'll hear more about, a process of assessment of really taking stock of what do we have the gifts to offer and how do those gifts align with the needs of our community. So with that, again, welcome. So glad that you've chosen to spend the time with us. And we're going to do introductions, but self-introductions. And I'll call on first Kate. Let you introduce yourself.
Hello, everybody. My name is Kate Morehead, and I'm the Dean of St. John's Cathedral in Jacksonville, Florida, where I have been for 11 years. We are in a blighted urban core, and this cathedral has birthed a number of ministries and a large shelter for the homeless here. Upon my arrival, I quickly realized that this neighborhood had become really a ghetto for people who were struggling with poverty economically or who were without housing. We had affordable housing here a bit and a lot of homelessness. So we started looking into how we could revitalize our neighborhood, but embrace those who are struggling as well and not gentrify or move them out. So we birthed a nonprofit, which is called the Cathedral District JAX. The Cathedral District is about a 36-block radius around this cathedral. And Jenny Myrick, who will introduce herself in a moment, is the CEO of this nonprofit. And we are building residential housing at the same time as working in conjunction with our shelter and our medical clinic to ensure that our homeless are both taken care of, but also that we're creating a socioeconomic diversity so that we can really walk alongside them more effectively and not ghettoize them. So it's a long journey, but we've had a lot of investment in our neighborhood. But I agree with Richard, the advent of COVID has really marked things, and we have been struggling much more acutely in this time. So I'm grateful to be with you today.
Thank you, Kate. Why don't you follow Jenny?
Hey, my name is Jenny Myrick, and I am the president and CEO of Cathedral District JAX. We sometimes just make it short by calling it CDJ. less of a mouthful. And as Kate has said, we are managing the redevelopment of 36 blocks around St. John's Cathedral in downtown Jacksonville. And it is an economic development effort more than it is anything else. But along with that, you have to be able to build neighborhood. It's sometimes in the jargon called building a sense of place. So this neighborhood has been fairly absent from any attention from the city for many, many years. Matter of fact, it could be as much as over 100 years. So what we did when we first started, we're a little over 5 years old. When we first started, we were lucky enough to receive a wonderful grant from the DuPont Fund. And we hired a master developer out of Washington, D.C. by the name of Torty Gallus and Partners. They spent quite a bit of time in the district. And we now have, if you go to our website, Cathedral District-Jacks, you'll be able to link onto that master plan. And it tells you where the residential should go, where the retail should go, what the streetscape should look like, what two-waying some of the one-way streets would be like. So those are wonderful facts. And we like to say we're operating off of fact and not just wishes, and that we have great patience. The genius of the district, I think, is that there are 5 Christian churches and only Christian churches in the district. So previous to our becoming more coalesced around a mission statement and a vision, none of these churches really had anything to do with each other. There's a Methodist, Lutheran, Presbyterian, us Episcopalians, and then there's an AME church. So previous to this, they were all doing their own little thing in their own silo. So what we have attempted to do over the past few years is bring those churches together so that all the pastors know each other and that they work on collaboratively on things together. So right now, in this past year, we have on the drawing board or in the process of permitting a little over 300 apartments that are mixed income apartments, which we believe is the silver bullet to stave off gentrification, and about $42 million worth of capital investment in the district. So so far we're on a roll. We want to keep on a roll. We're hoping we'll be able to produce, we haven't come to a clear number yet, but it's going to be over 1,000 new residential units in the district.
Thank you, Jenny. We'll hear more in a bit. Pam, would you introduce yourself, please? I'm frozen or Pam is. I believe Pam is. So if you can hear us, Pam, we're going to come back.
Yes, thank you. Okay, British accent, everyone. I'm okay. Can you hear me?
We can hear you now, Pam, if you want to try.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So accent rather gives it away. I'm the chief executive of the Connection at St Martin's, which is a big homelessness charity in the centre of London. So we're part of a system of organisations at the church, and each of those organisations has a governance link with the church. So we're based actually at the St Martin's main site, which is just off Trafalgar Square, right in the middle of London and sort of iconic tourist areas. And we're also in the epicentre of rough sleeping in the UK. So our local authority ward has got the highest concentration of rough sleepers in the country, with about 1,200 people a year found on the streets. There's actually about 3,000 a year across our local authority area in total. Prior to the pandemic, we were helping about 2,700 people a year through practical services like food and showers and access to IT, housing, benefits and immigration advice, that kind of thing. And also we were supporting people into mental health and addiction treatment services and did some work with people to get jobs. And we ran a big night shelter on our main site and a small supported accommodation service in South London. So we actually, similarly to some of the things you've heard from other contributors, we also have been taking quite a pivotal role in trying to get different interested agencies together to collaborate in their response to rough sleeping, because it's quite a complicated problem. But I can say a bit more about that when we go on to our input a bit later.
Sounds good, Pam. Thank you. And we heard it all.
Thanks.
And Dominic, would you take your turn?
Hi, everyone. So I'm the parish priest, that is the pastor at a church not far from where Pam is, in the centre of London, which is, the official name is Farm Street Church of the Immaculate Conception, but it's best known as Farm Street. We're the Jesuit church in central London. And over the last 30, 40 years, we've had quite a significant ministry also to the homeless in the city. During the pandemic, we've been the lead centre with other central London Roman Catholic churches, and working ecumenically and also interreligious and with other homeless agencies in running day services, including in Trafalgar Square, where Pam is, at Martin in the Fields over the summer, outreach, going out onto the streets as well, and giving out flyers and finding people accommodation. And in the past, we've run a night shelter, as St Martin's has, but of course that's become much more difficult during the pandemic for obvious reasons to do with COVID protocol. And so we've very much concentrated on the day services, which includes using the local businesses, the local hotels and restaurants in central London to provide a hot meal for the homeless and destitute, and also running mental health services, creative writing, art and performance therapy, and also advising on moving on. I'm also the chair of the Roman Catholic Diocese of Westminster Justice and Peace Department, so involved in advocacy work also for the homeless during the pandemic, which is quite a big thing at the moment in the UK.
Thanks very much. And last but by no means at all least, Donnell, would you introduce yourself?
Sure. Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Donnell Woodson. I am coming to you today by way of great city of Atlanta, Georgia. We are just overjoyed to be on this panel with so many great leaders, and honored by the invitation and work that we get to do with Richard, that you'll hear more of soon. The organization ministry that I work with is called Focused Community Strategies. We are a 45-year-old community development corporation, a faith-based community development corporation based in the urban core of Atlanta. Our work seeks to partner with under-resourced communities, neighborhoods, one neighborhood at a time, to provide innovative and holistic development that produces flourishing and thriving, or for many years, before it was saying flourishing and thriving, we would say shalom, or the peace of God. That is done in 4 divisions within our organization. Historically, for those 45 years, it has been in housing. And we may talk a little bit more about that. But then also economic development. And then a really key part of the work that we do is neighborhood engagement. We believe deeply in proximity, and that our work should be proximate, our relationships should be proximate, our ministry should be proximate. And then 4th is the division that I get to do my work with as a lead consultant, and that is the consultancy called the Lupton Center, named after our founder, Dr. Robert Lupton. Yeah, and I'm excited to get to talk more today. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, everyone. It's good to just begin with self-introductions so that we can then get to the meat of the conversation. You know, it was well, correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounded like Kate and Jenny that compared to maybe some of the ministries that others are involved in, it's called CDJ, right? That's the acronym. is relatively, well, it's not that old. I don't know how many years ago you started that effort. I'm curious what that process looked like. How could you discern that that's how your 5 faith-based organizations were called to come together? What was that process of discernment like? How did it get started?
Let me tell you a funny on Kate to start this. When she came to me, oh gosh, maybe 8 years ago at least, she came to me and she said, and I've gone to St. John's for many, many years. She said, I know there's something wrong with this neighborhood. I don't know what it is, and they don't teach you in priest school how to fix it. So we sat down with a bunch of people who I knew are urban planners. We started talking about it, and we came up with a plan, and the plan was to bring in the Urban Land Institute, ULI, which is international in scope. And they do a thing called a TAP, which is they put 4 to 7 professionals come and they study a small area that you've outlined and give you what I refer to as the roadmap as to how to turn things around. And that was clearly our starting point. It was wonderful. They said, form a 501c3, find a board of directors who can steer you, that have a talent pool that can do economic development. And then work in the community with who lives there. We now have about 1,500 people, most of which are poor seniors living in towers, 3 big towers that are in the district. But we clearly have, we've had many conversations about Robert Lupton. We are Luptonites. And we really believe in toxic charity and what he has written. When I first met him, I said, you've got great theory here, but where is your reality? Where does it happen? And then he came out with detox, charity. So we're big believers in that. So forming our nonprofit really is the vision of Dean Kate. And she brought it to me, and we gathered some other talented people around us that knew about economic development, and they knew about land use and zoning, and they knew about humanity. And from that, we grew into what we are today.
And I would say our biggest premise, and one of the reasons why we're able to develop so quickly right now, is the notion that we really need to be diverse socioeconomically, that the idea of having neighborhoods that church members go into and do ministry and then leave is not viable anymore. We have to live together with all kinds of people. And so looking at that model of socioeconomic diversity has helped us move into creating a neighborhood. And that's really our vision. We just want to create a sense of community, and we want people walking around, getting to know each other, and walking in and out of the churches.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me as a beneficiary of the thinkings of people like Bob Lupton and Sam Wells, who's connected with the connection. There's a lot of overlap with the idea of ministry with, not ministry for, or the idea of proximity that Donnell already mentioned. And I can only guess that, although I've not been to downtown Jacksonville, that a lot of the parishioners of the faith-based, of the churches, and I don't know if there are any non-Christian faith communities that are part of the CDJ, but that they don't necessarily live in the neighborhood where they attend church. And so there's that proximity, but you're creating a community, you're creating investment into the community where your churches are located. So that's
right. And it happens in stages. Like all of our parishioners are challenged every time they go to the grocery store to get 1 extra bag of groceries and drop it off during the pandemic. So we started a whole new food pantry that's going great bank guns, because if everyone would just do that, 1 extra bag, it's not much money. There's lots of 2-for-1s.
Yeah.
Or what Dominic was saying of partnering with local businesses that or restaurants that may not be able to serve, and have donors fund them to feed the hungry. Those are the kind of things that cross-pollinate and start building community.
So Jenny, how have things kept going? Because in DC, the commercial real estate is grounded to a halt. I mean, they were just trying to, if there were any deals in the works when, March and the shutdown set in, they were just trying to close deals, but not necessarily consider new projects.
Right.
How has the pandemic affected your development?
Well, we live in glorious Florida. So that's part of our, our star power. But the real estate market in Florida has not gone south. As a matter of fact, the home values are up a little, about 4.1% all throughout the throughout Florida. We are what a lot of people call the hottest real estate market in the United States today. What has been hurting has obviously, because of COVID, been the commercial sector of the market, where people don't go to their offices anymore, hence what we're doing. And there is a big public discussion about whether we'll go back to going back into offices or not, to the extent that we have been before. So that's kind of in flux. The number of homeless in Florida, which is a little over 31,000 people, is not the highest in the United States. The highest is in California. It's 151,000. These are 2020 numbers I'm giving you, 151,000 plus. And in New York is 92,000. So we're about even with Texas, right around 30,000 in the state of Florida. And a lot of it is in South Florida. So what has happened that has been most, I think most heartening, is that when you impose distancing and masks in a traditional homeless shelter, that throws half the people out. So we have seen an influx of people on the street because they can't distance and they can't mask and stay in a homeless shelter. So in our district, we have one of the largest homeless shelters in Florida, which I was proud to be one of the founders of. And there are several branches of it besides the one that's just in our district, but they're operating about 50% capacity. They still serve anybody who is hungry, comes for a meal. They serve anyone who comes. And there's a complete health unit that does dental, medical, vision. So those are still thriving and flourishing. And the weak link, though, is that there's more people on the street because they can't get into the shelters. But it's important to understand that the numbers overall in Florida, particularly, are going down with the homeless. The biggest numbers are in the veterans categories. And it all stems from this notion of housing first. And if the little bit of research that I've done over the years tells me, one of the starting models was in Finland, where they did housing first. And they boast that they've taken about 3,500 people off the street since 2007. So immediately it's housing first. And in what happened with COVID is that between the collaboration between the state and the federal government, they sent money to the local governments, who then were able to put people who wanted to be in a hotel room immediately. So we would have search parties go out, talk to them, and if they said, would you go to a hotel if we could put you in, and where they have running water, clean sheets, toilet, and privacy, and many of them said yes, and many of them said no. They were used to living on the street and they preferred that. From being in a hotel, which had been leased out for this purpose, then they moved to their own home. We have lots of nonprofits in Florida and all over the United States that build housing just for homeless. So then they enter into a lease and they have to perform just as you and I would on a lease. I won't go into the details of it, but similarly, when you're supposed to be there. So that process does work. Mm-hmm. It's a matter of personal choice, and it will always be personal choice if you want to come off the street. But if you understand completely the three buckets of what the homeless are, which is mental health, addiction to alcohol or addiction to drugs, and some smaller amount that is just down and out of their luck, then you understand the homeless population. If we could handle and address the mental illness portion of it, first and foremost, our numbers would drop substantially.
Thanks, Jenny. I know, Pam, just from your introduction, you talked about the real holistic approach to services that the Connection provides. How has COVID-19 impacted what you've been able to do and how the needs have evolved during the pandemic?
Do you know, it's always so nice doing events like this when you're speaking to colleagues from other countries, because you sort of draw on a lot of the same themes. So I've just been smiling. Ginny's been talking there. So, well, the pandemic has changed everything in lots of ways. It's been an absolute privilege, actually, to be part of the response. So, come middle of March, we started to see that we were going to have to do some things very differently. We had a good go at getting our clients to socially distance and wear masks and use hand gel and things like that. And there was quite a lot of confusion about doing that. And then the government said that they were going to call a lockdown. And we knew that we couldn't continue to run services in the way that we had been at all. Interestingly, also what happened in London was that one of the health and homelessness charities, and there's a couple of sort of specialist agencies that cross both disciplines, had done some research into communal sleeping spaces in other parts of the world, including particularly in the States, and scaremongered the government like you wouldn't believe about the spread of COVID and outbreaks and deaths in those settings. So the government were very persuaded by that data. I'm just sorry it took such tragedy in other countries for them to do the right thing, actually. But they did, and they announced a program called Everyone In. So we basically got phoned up by our local authority of Westminster, by their rough sleeping commissioner, who said, get everyone you can into a hotel, we'll pay. Now, we've never experienced anything like that before. And we also have a lot of clients who are probably not very hotel friendly, to be honest. But we got about 80 people into hotels over a 36-hour period, which was amazing. And then in the course of the following couple of weeks, a kind of system of hotel provision emerged in Westminster. About 300 people went into hotels in Westminster, a bit under 300. And there was a really interesting system across London where they triaged people into COVID protect facilities for people who were very clinically vulnerable, and people who just needed to self-isolate, and people who had COVID. And there have been virtually no COVID outbreaks in homelessness accommodation across London, certainly in the first wave. Now there are a few, but they're relatively small and well contained. And in Westminster, there were no COVID deaths in the rough sleeping population. It was amazingly successful. However, it meant that the whole rough sleeping system had to completely change in the course of about a week. And it was crazy, but also hugely rewarding and very effective. So we were able to get lots of our clients into hotels, and we ran 2 hotels. So we had one for 80 people, one for 30. And we ran those 2 facilities for about 3 months until the beginning of July. We also gave lots of mobile phones out to clients, and we did remote support, which worked quite well for some people and not well for others, as you might expect. We ran a really nice activity program for people where we could. So when people were going on their daily walk, for example, we got people to take photographs, and we've got this whole load of fantastic photographs of very empty London and spring in St James's Park, where people were staying in our hotel and then going out for walks and taking photographs. We also worked with our friends at The Passage, which is another big homelessness charity in central London that's Catholic. And they opened up a food hub, and we worked with them, and we did all the meals for the people in the hotels. So it was a fantastic joint effort, and our attempts at partnership working and trying to get people to collaborate were really accelerated as a result of the pandemic response, and we all started working much more closely together. And also the whole sort of pattern of street behaviour changed, because the kind of cycle of people bringing drugs into the centre of town, selling them, people begging, buying drugs, antisocial behaviour associated with drinking and drug use, all went away largely because the drug market was just, you know, like that system couldn't operate anymore. So what this meant was there was quite a large cohort of very chaotic people who'd been rough sleeping for a long time, who'd had their normal pattern of behaviour completely disrupted, and were then in hotels where they were in a single room rather than in a hostel with lots of people snoring, which is something I think we can all relate to, as being not a great place to get some sleep. And so people were basically in much quieter and more stable accommodation, and lots of people with really complicated issues did really well. And we were able to get lots of wraparound support because they were in one place, and there was amazing joint working that went on between treatment services for mental health, physical health, drug and alcohol problems, and also the housing and the ongoing support for getting people into accommodation and immigration advice for people. So that was all fantastic. I would love to tell you that it was all of it was all brilliant. However, whilst this was brilliant for the people that got into the hotels, the council decided, once they'd got an awful lot of people into hotels, and the numbers of people sleeping rough in Westminster went down from about 350 people at any one time to about 100. They decided that they were going to just leave it at the people they'd got, and that they weren't going to allow any more access to hotels for people. And so there was a smaller number of people who were still left on the streets, and it was impossible getting people into any accommodation at that point, because all of the supported accommodation pipelines had been completely rammed full of the people in the hotels, and then trying to move people out from the hotels and into longer term accommodation. And all of the normal kind of community sort of activity that you would get in central London wasn't there because it was lockdown. And so the amount of really disturbing scary criminal activity went up, and it was really frightening for people on the streets. And there was also things like no public toilets open and that kind of stuff. So mainly, from our point of view, we were able to do some amazing work, but there were also some real sort of issues about that disruption of service delivery, which meant that there was a small group of people who had a really awful time.
Yeah. Pam, as I listen to you talk, there are just so many things that resonate with me in terms of what I know has been going on here in Washington, D.C., so many parallels. Of course, the hotel strategy has been used here as well as many cities across the US. And it occurs to me too, a phrase that Ginny used may not be something that everyone's familiar with. And so I'm no expert, but I'll attempt to explain that the concept of housing first has to do with the belief among an increasing number of jurisdictions in the US that for people experiencing homelessness, as Jenny mentioned, there's intersecting and interrelated issues that present of what ultimately contributes to that experience, and the philosophy behind how to help and what one needs in the midst of that. In the past, perhaps one would look at someone who's experiencing mental illness or addiction issues and also experiencing homelessness, that they need to fix their health before they are eligible to get into the system, get a housing voucher. That has shifted. And so when we talk about housing first, it's operating from the belief that when you get someone housed first, then they'll have the capacity to deal with the other areas of healing that they need to address in their lives. The other thing that occurs to me too is just I'm completely ignorant to how the City of London interplays with, you know, nonprofits like yours and the partnerships that would exist in Jacksonville. And I don't know about Atlanta either, Donnell, but here in DC, our parish's program is not DHS funded, meaning local DHS, the Department of Health and Human Services. So we are independent. We have to follow, of course, the mayor's orders. But I know an organization that operates as a homeless shelter, an LGBTQ community center that primarily serves transgender women of color. They never shut down despite the encouragement to do so. And I'm proud of them for never shutting down. And they have not yet had one single COVID case in their shelter space. So sometimes the city too gets it wrong. I have conflicted feelings about how DC has handled things. But by and large, when feedback is given to the mayor's office, it is heard and processed and changes are addressed. For example, St. Margaret's partners with another parish, which is arguably more similar to St. Martin's the Field than ours, because we're north of the very downtown center at St. Margaret's, but Church of the Epiphany is right in the downtown center and very analogous to the way St. Martin's functions in the city of Lebanon. And they have a homeless ministry as well that operates on Sundays. And they have a street church partnership where they go to a park in central DC, right in front of the new Washington Post headquarters. And they have street church. And so St. Margaret's picked up the effort of doing bagged meals in the park on Tuesdays, and then the city closed the park for a scheduled renovation. So the disjointedness, having to really respond in real time, has been a day by day, sometimes month by month process. Dominic, what else would you add about the context in London?
Okay, yeah, thanks, Richard. It's great to hear the story of London during the pandemic from Pam as well, and also everyone else, and so many shared concerns and shared policies, wraparound support and housing first. And I'll just kind of maybe pick it up from there, from where we got involved as the Central London Catholic Churches and Farm Street. So the Everyone In scheme, which Pam referred to, was a tremendous success. And it was hailed as a tremendous success. And, agencies like the Connection at St. Martin's, very much part of that with the hotels and all of those homeless who they were able, the government and local authority were able to get into the hotels. Suddenly, for the first time, they had some dignity, and it really changed people's behaviour. I mean, you see that from those who attend our day services, who were in the hotels, and who found they were actually they changed, over that period of a couple of months. As Pam said, the truth of it was that not everyone was in. Everyone in fact, didn't mean that at all. And there was a bit of a gap, although that was a tremendous success. There was a bit of a gap between what was being reported and the policy and what was the truth. So we ended up in mid-March. We, at the time, were running night shelter several months of the year for one night a week. Well, not a huge commitment, and we have a couple of soup and sandwich runs and clothes runs around central London during the week, but every week of the year. But we ended up, walking out into the streets in mid-March. And I don't know what Washington or Jacksonville or Atlanta was like, but London, I mean, as Pam alluded to, you walk out into the street. We live above the shops, so we live right in the centre of London. Our geographical boundaries of our parish are Oxford Street, Regent Street, Park Lane, Piccadilly. So we're right slap bang in the middle, and the largest homeless population in that area now in central London. And so you'd walk out and walk eastwards towards the district of Soho. You might know those who visited London. Normally a really lively area, lots of bars, restaurants, full of life, day and night. It was a complete ghost town, the whole of London. And the only people you realised you'd see on the streets were about 100 or so. I think there were probably more than that. I think at its height there were about 200, 300 who seemed maybe coming in from outside of London as well, who were left on the streets. So one of the Catholic churches right in the middle of Soho, one of the Roman Catholic churches called St. Patrick's, which did a lot of work with the homeless, they put on 2 meals a day. And they just, first of all, they had people coming in and cooking, volunteers. And the square, Soho Square, if anyone's been there, an iconic square in London, but a small square. And it was filled with about up to 200 homeless twice a day. And they would stay there because there wasn't anywhere else to go. There was no one to beg from. There's nowhere open, nothing at all. And as Pam's already said, the worst thing of all, there were no restrooms. Okay, no restrooms, no toilets, no loos, whatever we call them, no bathrooms. And of course that led, without going into full detail, to a lot of antisocial behaviour. A lot of it was really bad, as Pam has alluded to, and we were right kind of in the middle of that and seeing what was going on, in going over to St. Patrick's and helping them and staying there the whole day and chatting to the homeless. and a lot of it was yeah, criminal. I mean, you know, there were fights. You know, there was drinking which had to be broken up. But there was also, I mean, there was antisocial behaviour which related to the fact there weren't any toilets for about 3 miles between them. So as a result, people had nowhere to go to the toilet, nowhere to go to the restroom. So the police got very concerned, local residents got very concerned, and of those 200 people who were congregating around this one place, the local authority then decided that they wanted to ask somewhere else to open up. As Pam said, everyone in came to an end. When there were no more hotels, there was no more accommodation. The only people on the streets were this 200 so homeless. And so we were asked to set up something else. And there were a couple of places which were chosen as setting up a food kitchen. Both of those places, there were complaints from residents about it. Eventually, the place which was chosen by the local authority, Westminster City Council, back in April, was Trafalgar Square, iconic, right by St Martin in the Fields. Why? Because there's no one who lives around there, because there's no one to complain. So we ended up for the whole, up till the end of June, serving food there. Where did we get the food from? Well, eventually the volunteers, and we got between the different churches, we got up to 50 volunteers in Trafalgar Square on a rota who 5 times a week would be serving meals, light meals at that point, in fact. And then we were asked to add a shower service in a church, another church in Soho, another Catholic church. And now we've moved to our own parish here to the hall, where we're, as I was saying before, this wraparound service. And what we were also doing was working, as Kate and Ginny have been talking about in Florida, working with the local community, with the local businesses as well, and finding that there was just a huge generosity, that when we were able to say, you know, the few security staff who were left in the first lockdown in the hotels, you know, were realized when we went to them, and these were people we hadn't really known very well beforehand. We'd crossed swords a little bit with planning applications and that kind of thing. But then we go and say, you know, well, I know that some of your security staff are getting complaints because of the homeless and the crime on the streets. But what's actually happening is there's nowhere for them to go, and they're going to actually die of hunger. They're going to die of starvation. So big hotels ended up providing the meals completely free of charge. And I worked out that the bill in the end would have been, to whoever it was to go to for one hotel, would be about £300,000. I don't know what that is in dollars. Maybe it's 700,000, something like that. You know, up till June. So what we're doing now, over the period of time in the summer, to cut a long story short, we decided that now we were up to having about 80 volunteers across the churches who wanted to come in and help with our services. And so we were able to work with the local authority to also get some ideas, well, really to form a network whereby there would be different services available, day services available around the centre of London. And we ended up working extremely well with the local authority and being asked to do this. And at the heart of this was also fundraising. So we raised quite a lot of money for the project. And as a result now, so we're actually able to pay the hotels and the businesses, and especially those restaurants and pubs that are really suffering at this time. Yeah. What we're seeing is that there are more people in this lockdown who are coming onto the streets. And that's because of the economic downturn, especially in the hospitality sector. People are losing their jobs. And so we're going around and, as I say, giving out flyers. We find lots of new homeless around at the moment. And the plan is, with government and local authority, is still to get everyone in. It's not quite working like that because there's just too much of a need. And there are people coming in who fall through the gaps.
Yeah, Dominic, thank you. I want to get Donnell into the conversation.
Sorry, I've probably gone on too long. Okay. Yeah.
No, but there's so many synergies with what I know is going on in DC and what you're describing in London, that push and pull with the city, the problems that kind of move from neighborhood to neighborhood. Donnell, St. Margaret's is now benefiting from a partnership with the Lupton Center, which is the consulting side of FCS ministries. But I know that you can only consult with churches like ours because you have, I think you said, over 40 years of lived experience of doing the work of community development. So how has Atlanta and your specific neighborhood FCS context been impacted by COVID?
Yeah, let me begin by saying that this is just such a rich conversation. I've so appreciated the synergy in ministries in these very different contexts. And for us, the in answering your question has been that it has been extremely hard. But what we have uniquely done, or even that is kind of the secret sauce of our ministry, is that we are both centered in neighborhoods deeply impacted by COVID-19, and then also we are daily doing the work, the practice of ministry in that same neighborhood. And so it has meant that we had to deeply hold to what is center for us, and that center for us is being rooted in a place or rooted in our neighborhood. And that has been the joy within a lot of pain that has happened in Atlanta at large, but more specifically in our unique neighborhood, being rooted in the neighborhood. So the neighborhood is called Historic South Atlanta. It's not the bottom half of Atlanta that most people think, but it is an actual neighborhood just under 2 miles in length, roughly under 6,000 folks who are in this space. And watching our neighborhood center around itself and find the ability to, whether homeless, whether low income, whether middle income, or even the small portion of the neighborhood that's well off, find the ability to thrive in the midst of such pain, has been a joy to really watch come to life. Between COVID-19, racial injustice, nationwide unrest, we just confronted just really devastating hurt every day of 2020. I've said this in many other instances of getting to speak or write this year, that the pain of the nation and really the globe had spilled onto the streets of Atlanta, and in particularly the streets of our neighborhood. And that showed itself in COVID-19, but also when one of the horrible killings that we watched many of in 2020 of Black males happened literally in our neighborhood with Rashard Brooks. And his family is a part of our after school programs, and the family members work in our grocery store and in our coffee shop. And so while we were dealing with many issues like homelessness and COVID-19, there were these other things that our neighbors were grappling with, confronted with, not just in theory or by way of television, but literally in their everyday lives. And because we were proximate and we've done this work for 20 plus years in this particular neighborhood, it meant that we were well equipped to respond to the issue of a pandemic or the issues of racial injustice, especially in this unique way. It allowed us to find shelter in our place. South Atlanta, our neighborhood, really became a place of shelter. And it was beautiful to watch how our neighborhood, whether it was in the spread of COVID-19, the realities of loss of jobs because of pandemic, or this racial injustice, in particular, this particular case, it really, our neighborhood became a hedge against these calamities of the outside world. And so we watched the neighborhood respond in the instance of that killing, but our campus was also vandalized, 22 windows in our grocery store and coffee shop destroyed, and graffiti spread all over our building. And it was our neighbors, even in the midst of COVID-19, even in the midst of loss of job of themselves, and even homeless neighbors who came to the aid of our organization, our ministry that's serving them, to do two things. One, clean up. So by 8 o'clock in the morning, I should note that those who did the damage were young teenage hipsters out of the suburbs who thought that they were doing a justice in support, but not recognizing that our grocery store and ministry was actually there as a support to this community. But by 8 o'clock, the neighbors had came and cleaned up the glass, had covered the building, had done multiple interviews with newscasters, rewriting the narrative of what people were going to believe about our place, about our community. As a result, we saw our neighbors, both, again, and by neighbors I mean residents who rent, residents who are homeless, residents who are of means, all give the narrative that they wanted the world to hear about their place. And we were just partakers in that. Along with that, Richard, we were able to, during this time, provide over 500 bags of groceries through our Share the Love campaign to families and individuals. We supported 280 households and roughly 1,120 individuals with food, utility assistance, rent and mortgage assistance, and mortgage forgiveness, which was extremely important in this conversation of how in our work we shift the paradigm as we care for homeless and others, right? That we think differently, not just about the money that we can collect to meet the immediate need, but that work that we got to do during the 2020 year was really thinking about how do we create relief and forgiveness so that there isn't a need to come back later, right? It's not deferred, but it's forgiven. Yeah, so that's just a little bit of how we were able. Oh, I should also note that 12 of our employees, who some of which were formerly homeless, who are now working in our businesses, our partners came alongside, and we were able to keep 12 of those employees who are neighborhood residents all employed, even when our businesses were completely shut down. So that kind of innovation is how we responded. Yeah.
I appreciate especially your sharing of the experience of being right in the center of Rayshard Brooks community, and appreciate how FCS and the South Atlanta neighborhood was able to come together and support their family. I have some seminarian classmates who are part of the ministry there. So I know it's been, our own presiding bishop talks about the triple pandemics of COVID-19, race, and like-mindedness in the US this year. And it's so real that those of us responding to issues of homelessness intersect with the issues of systemic racism, especially in America. Time flies when you're having a rich conversation. So I'm lamenting the fact that there's not more time, but we will stay probably till at the latest 4:15. And the conversation is being recorded. So if you do have to drop off in a few minutes, no worries. Feel free to revisit the recording that will be shared after the fact. I do want to invite your questions. I see the ones that have come in already, but do add them in the chat box if you have questions. We'll do our best to get to as many as possible. I want to pose one right back to you, Donnell, since you just had the floor, come right back, follow up, and then anyone else can add too. But Valerie, higher up in the chat feed, asked about being in a suburban context and asked what insights you have for bridging the economic and cultural gaps around, well, those proximity issues, right? If there's a suburban parish, she doesn't name it, but I wonder too about the racial gaps of if there's a majority white neighborhood seeking to be in relationship with a different neighborhood that is facing different challenges. So how does a church go about doing that? How do you be aware of not the doing for, but the being with, the doing with? Does that make sense?
Yes, no, it does. Our approach, Valerie and audience, is this idea, I've used it, and I think that's going to be my soapbox for today, is proximity, right? And this idea, this concept of being rooted in place. I think that the two of those yield innovative and comprehensive, and even make the simple and mundane solutions really effective when you are proximate with your approach. When you are, for us, we would say we would desire to do with, in, and for. And any of those silos really begin to produce the toxicity that Bob Lupton is known for talking about in Toxic Charity or any of the 12 books that he's written. But I think when you see the effectiveness of our work in the urban epicenter, or that a plethora of suburban, for your question, communities that are grappling with this same issue, many of them formerly kind of sundown towns that have historically thought differently about other, whether that's race or homelessness, and are trying to make this paradigm shift to address caring for the homelessness in a holistic way, thinking about the issue not on the larger scale, but as it relates to your geographic location. Much of the practices that we are, and principles that we are using, we're not translating them in a way that is designed to mimic how effective they are in our place, but more discovering what they would look like in this particular context. So there is a similarity across the spectrum between poverty and homelessness by way of the reality of what poverty means, having less or not enough, and homelessness being without shelter. Outside of those two things, I would say everything about homelessness or poverty is specific to geographic location and boundary. Thus, your practices and principles that you need to use or implement in that place have to be as particular to that geographic boundary. And so if there's homelessness in the small town or suburban context, especially along the lines of this mentality that oftentimes divides, I think bridging the gap has to take the context of one, finding or discovering how you can be, we use the analogy of a quarterback. How can you be rooted in place in a way that discovers not just the effectiveness of your ability to care for the homelessness, but your ability to understand homelessness in your context. And then once you begin to understand, it was alluded to that alcohol, drug, and mental issue is oftentimes those three big categories that lead to that. Dr. Deborah, just under this in the comments, pointed to that's rooted in also in stereotypes. The pandemic showed us that homelessness is oftentimes caused by these other extenuating circumstances that lead to that. And there's a large demographic, especially in the suburban context, that isn't being described in our myth and narrative about the homelessness that we have got to rewrite. And I believe that in the suburban context, we're discovering that suburbia has the ability to help us understand on a more deeper level who really represents homelessness. And that in doing so, this unique way, this unique approach of caring for homelessness in your context will provide to the field of those of us caring for the homelessness unique ways to care for them. So I'm intentionally not giving you a clear like 1, 2, 3 step, because I think it's unique to your place, but that you also have the opportunity in suburban context to really begin to rewrite the narrative about homelessness.
Yeah, and what I hear you saying, Donnell, is that it's formed through the proximate relationships. South Atlanta is an example of really laser focus investment in a specific community. Perhaps when we have the sequel to this webinar 20 years from now, Kate and Jenny will be able to come back and say that the same has occurred and succeeded in downtown Jacksonville, for example.
Yes.
What would others add to the question of, if your church isn't currently involved in ministry with those experiencing homelessness and is interested in being of help, what advice do you have?
I'd like to tag on what Donnell was saying by just saying it begins with relationship. So if there are suburban parishes that can establish relationship with those who are on the street, and there are so many different ways to do that. One way that I love is some kids with cell phones start documenting messages to their loved ones. If someone's on the street, do they want to give a message to someone, and do they want to be videotaped saying a message, or that could be emailed or sent to a loved one. There are just so many ways, but the establishing of relationship is where Christ enters in and does miraculous things. But until someone knows another person as human, it just doesn't work.
Richard, can I add to Kate, since Kate just added onto my, we'll keep going back and forth, Kate. I think thinking innovatively about your current programs can also be a good starting point for those that are saying or asking, what can we do new? I would say, what can we do new with what we already have? And for us, the Lupton Center thinks uniquely about, and I'll unapologetically say it, and hope if I step on toes, you know that it's with love. But whether it's thinking about a food pantry program for us, I'll throw out there Urban Recipe is our food co-op program that is a paradigm shift of how we think about, how we thought about our program for caring for the materially poor by way of a food pantry. How can we add dignity and identity and get proximate? And so we didn't change, throw the baby out with the bathwater. We wanted to still provide that service, but we also wanted to add dignity and identity into it. And so now the inner workings of that, it's community led. The lines of delineation that between the giver and the receiver are no longer there. And it's a sense of pride and identity and ownership in the community. So discover those ways before going to do something new. Discover those ways that you could think differently, or make a paradigm shift with the current programs that you have in suburban or in your church parish.
Well, I'll do another shameless plug for Donnell, so he doesn't have to do it himself, and just say that because I know the Lupton Center well, if you visit their website, there's tons of resources. For example, they have a wonderful paradigm shift of a model for the very popular Give a Poor Kid a Christmas Gift program, where you adopt a name. I suggest you check out their approach to how you go about having an effective kind of Christmas time or holiday time ministry. We are about out of time, but I want to pose the final question to our London friends and then offer a closing prayer. I think at least Dominic mentioned that you're involved in local advocacy, and a question from, where did it go? From Christine and Carol asks, how does the church help politicians understand the various needs?
Well, I think a lot of politicians do understand, and I think politics is very complicated, at least it is in the British context, and I know it is in the
It's complicated in the US.
more complicated as well. For us who've been watching it from the outside, certainly over the last couple of months. But here, no, I mean, it's also getting proximate to the politicians, and it's also being real. It's also working in conjunction with them, you know, and finding that I mean, people go into politics for all sorts of reasons, but I mean, I know politicians who are very specifically religious. They can't be quite as religious as you can be explicitly in the United States. But there are people also have a very big heart. They go into politics, and they can't do much publicly because they are they're constrained by their constituents. They're constrained by their colleagues in their parties. But somehow, I think the churches can, through working in conjunction with politicians, can find a way to begin to raise awareness of these issues, in which they can, between themselves, they can find a way to transform awareness and of the issues around homelessness. And in Britain, everybody in you know who's involved wants to end rough sleeping forever, and we need to work together.
Pam, final thoughts on that or any other topic?
Richard, let me add to what Dominic just said, which is right on point. I think people always say, well, how can you make something happen that you know where the solutions might be, but you can't get the politicians to respond to it? And I'm a former elected official, and we respond to people who come to us and say, this has got to happen. And every single church that we are affiliated with or go to, they are made up of, first and foremost, Christians who are going there, but secondarily, their constituents. And if they form a coalition of themselves and say, what we want is a reprioritizing of your dollars, that's how it gets changed. And when I said at the onset, these three different buckets of what the homeless fall into, what has is dramatically wrong is not that they need sandwiches being given to them in a park. They need mental health services, which are much more expensive, much more sophisticated, much more difficult to administer. So that happened back in the 60s, if you look at the history of homelessness, when people were integrated and mainstreamed. You hear the song, the term mainstreamed. They did it in schools, they did it with the homeless, they did it with prisoners. That's when it started. So, but the constituency are the people who go to our churches. And they can very easily apply gentle, persuasive, if you have the facts, influence on elected officials who then reroute that priority. Right now, it's really low down here, really low. So if you can get it to be up in the top third, you will see some dramatic changes.
Or not so gentle would be okay too. Perhaps.
Well, I prefer the gentle part, I'll tell you. Really,
yeah.
You know.
No, thank you for adding that, Jenny. That I totally agree with what you just said.
I would add, I think that what has brought our councilmen all the way up to mayor to state level leaders, to our neighborhood, to our table, to being partners with FCS, is that we, even as a ministry, as a nonprofit, began to think comprehensively about the work that we did in the 4 areas that I mentioned. So that such that when you look at our portfolio, it looks like a for-profit entity. If you're looking at our housing fund, if you're looking at our funding structure, if you're looking at the types of multi-family housing that we're doing, the type of businesses that we've done, we've made ourselves appealing to the whole of what will make a neighborhood work, but we've also reshaped the narrative of what the world thinks about the church and the church's value in solving these issues. And most of them have seen the church as a silo unto itself. And so we wanted to reshape, redefine that narrative, and once again, bring the church to the place of development of city and place. And when we began to think comprehensively, so in two parts, one with Bob Lupton in that first half of our 45 years, and the last 25 has been leaders who Bob has turned the organization over, and he's not, I don't want to say out to pasture, but retired and in his second stage of life. But the leadership of the last 25 years has really developed a comprehensive plan, such that it's not just about being the hands and feet of Jesus, but it's wrapping that idea, that ideology into a rooted in place theology with really great business plan and really great execution and really great return on the investment. And so city officials and the like, and even real estate are wanting to be our partner. So how can you attract in that kind of way is what I would say, and get back to the business of being rooted in place.
Totally makes sense. Pam, now final thoughts.
I suppose, you know, I can give you all something quite big to think about in that case. Rough sleeping in particular, within the umbrella term of homelessness, happens because of two sets of things. One of them is about structural failure, which is things like housing policy, breakdown in adult health and social care, all that sort of stuff. And then there are people's individual choices, which are not always brilliant. And those two sets of things conspire to create some very, very difficult, complicated, and very sad situations for people. There is a real tendency when talking about rough sleepers to focus on people's individual behavioural failures and not to talk enough about the system's failure. And actually, exactly as Ginny has said, you can give people sausages for breakfast every day for 3 years, and they will not be any less homeless at the end of those 3 years. If you actually want them to be not homeless anymore, they need a decent place to live. They probably need fairly intensive treatment services in order to address things like underlying childhood trauma and so on. And you're not going to get that unless you can put forward a pretty sophisticated case to decision makers in order to invest quite a significant amount of money in meaningful, long-term funded services for people who are facing multiple deprivation and have done over a sustained period for many years. So stick to the structural stuff and keep the relational behavioural stuff to your individual relationships with the people that you're supporting, because there are some stories that you want to tell and some stories where it's probably not going to help you if you share too much of those. And that's difficult. That's a difficult balance to achieve. And that is a huge topic.
That is huge, but so well said as an introduction. I mean, it makes me think of the fact that at St. Margaret's, we're really trying to do away with that favorite analogy of give someone a fish, you know, they'll always need it, but teach someone to fish. No, what it really is about is access to the damn water, access to where the fishing and abundant life occurs that can happen in a self-sustaining kind of way. So thank you all for a really rich conversation. Thank you to those of you who stuck with us as we've gone a little over time. I hope you'll dwell on these words, and please follow up with the panelists with any questions for further conversation. If we can offer any assistance, I know I can speak for all of us to say that we would be happy to chat one-on-one with anyone else who is wanting to dive into this topic more fully. If I may, I'd love to close us in prayer. as I did with our panelists as we began. One of my favorites from the Book of Common Prayer for the poor and neglected. May God be with you. Let us pray. Almighty and most merciful God, we remember before you all poor and neglected persons whom it would be easy for us to forget. The homeless and the destitute, the old and the sick, and all who have none to care for them. Help us to heal those who are broken in body or spirit, and to turn their sorrow into joy. Grant this, O God, for the love of your incarnate word, who for our sake became poor, Jesus Christ, our Savior. Amen. Thanks, everyone. Have a good afternoon. Or night. Good night.